Okay, so today I'm going to be making a custom order, which is going to be a little plinth. I believe that's the word. So let's make it. No explanation needed. You'll see what happens.
Okay people, check this out. So I got a commission work and the client wanted me to make a plinth so he could display his artwork. If you have no idea what a plinth is like I did, it's just a base that holds a statue or artwork. The client gave me the dimension that he wanted and the pattern he wanted, and pretty much I'm making a big box out of skateboards. But it's not as easy as it sounds. So I started to prepare these skateboards. I'm using my newly built D-Gripper 5000, which is a heating lamp that heats up the grip tape, which makes it easier for me to remove the grip tape. I'm also using a dowel to roll the grip tape off all in one piece. Next, I could cross-cut them into different sections. First the nose and tails, and then the hardware pieces, and then I flip the board around and do the same thing. And then I'm left with the middle, which is the straightest and the most useful section of these skateboards. And in total, I prepped 20 different skateboards and it was just enough to make this plinth. I then take it over to the table saw and do something called a tax cut. This is cutting off both edges of the middle sections, and this not only gives me a straight edge I could reference off of, but one of the skate shop owners likes to make things out of these strips, and for him, these strips are the history of these boards and where it's been, so I like to save them. I mean, after all, he's the one who's giving me all these recycled skateboards. Once I'm done with the tax cut, I could then start cutting these skateboards into strips. I set the fence 1/4 inch away from the blade and use a push stick to prevent these thin strips from kicking back. And I'm making sure to sort them after each board so I'm not mixing up any of the colors. I'm also making sure I have at least 20 strips per board in order to make this work, and luckily it was just enough to make this work, as you'll see later. After cutting them into strips, I could lay them out and figure out the pattern that I could use. In order to get the most out of these boards, I needed to book match them, so I picked out the color pattern I wanted and checked to make sure I had enough strips. Now that I'm done prepping all the skateboards, I can start breaking down the plywood I need in order to pin nail these strips down to. I'm using a 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood that I got from Home Depot, and I guess it really doesn't matter what type of plywood I use since I'm using the plywood just for structural reasons and none of the plywood faces will show. Now these strips might look square, but there's a chance it might be a little off, and since there's so many connecting points, I want to make sure these strips are nice and square so you won't see any gaps between the strips and it looks like a continuous line throughout the plinth. I just need to make sure these are longer than 12 inches, which the base of this sled is, and I'm just roughly eyeballing it. I'm also cutting few strips in half in order to stagger these strips so there's no clear visible joint lines and everything looks seamless. Once I have the strips and the plywood ready, I can start pin nailing these strips to the plywood. I first mark some guidelines to the plywood and screw down a straight edge right in the middle of the plywood. I can then reference that and start pin nailing the strips. After the first strip is glued down, I stagger the next strip and glue them down. By doing this, the connecting points won't be as visible and make it look like one continuous line without any breaks. I'm using glue to laminate the strips securely and using the pin nails to clamp them down. I'm also pin nailing them at 45-degree angle so none of the pin nails will be visible from the top. And once I'm done pin nailing one side, I remove the straight edge and do the other side. I'm just making sure to mirror exactly so the strips will look book matched. And I'm making sure to stagger them as well. After I was done making 4 sides of the plinth, I can get started on the top of the plinth. I'm making an X pattern on the top to connect all the lines together to make it look seamless. And I had just enough left over to make this top, and all I really needed is 4 triangles and connect them together. And I'm referencing off the side panels to make sure I have the right pattern and spacing between the strips. Now to cut this into triangle, I decided to use my track saw, and I held these strips together temporarily with blue tape. And once all 4 triangles have been cut, I can tape them all together nice and tight. Now to glue these strips to the plywood, I'm using a vacuum bag. This is one of the strongest ways to glue 2 panels together. And this is way easier than pin nailing each of these strips to the plywood. While the vacuum is doing its thing, I started sanding down the panels with the drum sander. And once the top panel has finished laminating, I can take off the blue tape and send it through the drum sander as well. Once all the panels are sanded down to its final thickness with the drum sander, I can start cutting them up into their final size. I first get a straight edge on each panel using the track saw, essentially jointing them. Then I can take it over to the table saw and cut it into its final width. And then I can use the crosscut sled to cut it into its final length. And if you look at it carefully, you can see the sparks flying off because I'm cutting the pin nails, so I'm making sure to avoid those and not getting hit by them. And once all the panels are cut into their final size, I can start cutting the miters. The side panels will get a miter on each side, and I'm using a sled to get a miter on the top of these panels as well. And the top panel will get a miter on all 4 sides. And finally, all the miters are cut and I can check to see how they all fit using some blue tape. And once I was happy with the miters, I can glue all the panels together. I think I used most of the clamps that I have and made sure to get a good lamination since I'm not really reinforcing this plinth other than glue. The actual artwork the client plans on displaying isn't more than 10 pounds, so I just need this plinth to be strong enough to stay together. It's the next day and I can start removing all the clamps and check how the glue up went. And once everything looks good, I can move on to finishing. I sanded this plinth using 100 grit to remove any sanding marks from the drum sander. I also added a small roundover on all the edges to make it nice and smooth. Now there were a few gaps here and there, and that's kind of expected when you're laminating over 400 strips together. And I like using this UV Cure clear resin from TOTALBOAT. It cures by either exposure to natural sun or artificial UV light like I'm using here. From my experience, it fills the gap better than CA glue and sands a lot better than CA glue as well. If you're interested, use the link in the description and get a nice little discount from TOTALBOAT. I also added these rubber feet on the bottom of the plinth so it's off the ground. And finally, I can sand it up to 150 grit to get it ready for finishing. I'll be using Rubio Monocoat for finishing, and they recommend you don't sand any higher than 180 grit and recommend that you stop at 150 grit to allow the oil to penetrate into the wood. Once I'm finished sanding, I use mineral spirits to wipe the plinth down. This helps to remove any dust on the plinth and preps it for finishing. It also gives you a nice little preview of how your finish will look like. And once the mineral spirits have dried, I can finally put on the finish. I'm using Rubio Monocoat, which is a simple wipe on and wipe off finish. These are not only easy to use, but they're extremely durable. It's made to be used on hardwood floors, and it gives me a peace of mind that it will be nicely protected. I just wipe it on thoroughly and let it sit. And after about 10 minutes, I can come back with a dry cloth and remove any excess. And it will be okay for you to touch, but the finish will fully cure in about a week. And here it is, a plinth made out of 20 different recycled skateboards. I really like how all the lines connect at the top and everything looks seamless. The final dimensions were 24 inches tall, 14.5 inches wide and deep. Once it was cured, I packed it up into a crate and shipped it out to Canada, and the client seems to be very happy with it. So that's it for this video. I'm trying to be more open to commissions, so if you have anything you want made out of recycled skateboards and have a decent budget, make sure to visit my website, which is woby.design. If you haven't already, make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below what you think about this plinth, and let me know if you actually knew what a plinth was. Thanks again, and until next time, bye!